video, we'll be discussing the Paris Peace Conferences of 1919. These were the peace conferences that were held by the Allies to determine the post-war order in post-World War I Europe, and had a significant effect on the world going forward. Now, one common misconception is that the end of World War I was decided just by the Treaty of Versailles, but rather each of the members of the Central Powers got their own treaty. So the Treaty of Versailles actually only concerned Germany. And of course they were negotiated in Paris, near Paris, in the Palace of Versailles, which is where the name comes from. But the different allies had competing goals. Now, the various goals, the main sort of major powers were Britain, France, and the US. Now, the US, led by President Woodrow Wilson, who is that one there, he sought to pass through his 14 points for peace. So this included things like establishing an independent Poland with free access to the sea, giving France back Alsace-Lorraine, simple stuff, but also other things such as the League of Nations, which America then wouldn't go on to join, and some other things. And his sort of main philosophy was self-determination. So the people of an area will get to decide who they go to. Although the US wouldn't end up having that much impact on the actual negotiations, and it'd more so be led by France and Britain. And France, they had been defeated by Germany in 1870, losing Alsace-Lorraine in the process. They'd just been through another massive, devastating war, which had been fought mainly on French soil. And so they wanted security. They wanted to crush Germany. In fact, they were actually proposing to fully dismantle Germany, return it back to what the borders of the German states were back in 1870. And whilst they didn't accomplish that, they did still try to take away as much land from Germany as possible and surround Germany with French allies, all in order to ensure their own security. And as for the British, well, of course, expanding the British Empire, and in fact these treaties are sort of the reason why the British Empire was at its greatest extent in 1921, and so after they'd taken lands, especially off of the German Empire, taking lands such as Germany's African holdings, but they also sought stability and the restoration of the balance of power. So the idea there was to basically make sure that Europe would have a bit of a balance. And so you'd have like the Germans, you'd have the French, you'd have such and such, and they'd balance each other out. So therefore, Britain wouldn't have to get involved again. This had actually been British foreign policy for a couple of centuries by that point. Now, onto the actual treaties themselves. So, first of all, Versailles. This is the big one. This is the one that concerned Germany. And one of the main clauses, and this is one of the things that Germany was most concerned about, was the War Guilt Clause. So this said that Germany had to accept full responsibility for starting the Second World War. And whilst there will practically always be debate over how much responsibility they actually had, this basically forced them to accept full responsibility for causing the entire war, which naturally didn't exactly please the German populace. And of course they were also famously forced to pay an enormous amount of reparations, about 3 times their entire GDP in 1918, although they weren't truly expected to pay back all of that. They were still expected to pay back a lot of it, either in hard currency, gold, or raw materials, which eventually led to the Ruhr occupation, and where Belgium and France occupied the industrial Ruhr area of Germany, and while the Weimar Republic promised to pay everyone's wages, so long as they didn't work for the French and Belgians, and that sort of led to the Weimar Republic's famous hyperinflation crisis. It also demilitarized Germany, banned them from having an air force, banned them from having U-boats, and set them to have an army of only 100,000 men, which was smaller than Belgium. And then, perhaps most famously, the loss of territory. So, Alsace-Lorraine, France, once open Melanie there to Belgium, the Saarland became its own independent protectorate, and then got a referendum on whether it wanted to join France or join Germany. It joined Germany, almost unanimously. Northern Schleswig to Denmark, who hadn't even fought in the war, and yet the Allies had actually tried to force the Danish into accepting more land than they actually wanted to, until Wilson stepped in and got the Allies to back down. A tiny bit to Czechoslovakia, and then a whole bunch to Poland, there, the Polish corridor, a particular area of contention, along with, of course, Germany losing all of its colonies. Then we have Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the treaty that concerned the Austrian half of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as you can see in the brown there. Now, of course, it was forced to pay reparations, it was demilitarized just like Germany, and it lost territory. In this case, Austria lost Tyrol, it lost Trieste and Istria, its Croatian territories, Slovenia, Czechia, Galicia. Although, interestingly enough, it did actually gain this little bit of land here off of Hungary, despite the fact that the Austrians had actually been the half of the empire that had been the most vehemently in support of the war, and of going to war in the first place. And yet, the Hungarians lost even more, so. And also, another interesting point is they were prohibited from Anschluss, or union, with Germany, as to make sure that Germany couldn't become too powerful. So, and this was something of a point of contention, as Anschluss was actually decently popular in Austria for quite a while, although the popularity of it sort of waned a bit after the Nazis took power, although it was still a very broadly popular political movement. Then we have Trianon for Hungary, and this is perhaps the second most famous of the treaties, mostly because Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory, which included some rather significant areas that actually held Hungarian minorities, or in some cases even Hungarian majorities, along with, of course, reparations and demilitarization. And the whole thing of, losing territories that not only had been administered by Hungary for centuries by that point, but were also populated by Hungarians, would force Hungary to try and adopt a somewhat more revanchist style of foreign policy. And this is one of the reasons why the Little Entente, an alliance between Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, formed in order to counter Hungarian influence, although it didn't really end up working out. And then we have Neuilly-sur-Seine, which is sort of the least important one. It concerned Bulgaria. They'd already lost the Second Balkan War back in 1913, and there wasn't really all that much more that the surrounding powers really wanted to take off of it. There wasn't really much more in the way of minorities living within Bulgaria that other countries wanted to take into their own nation, besides the idea of incorporating Bulgaria into the new Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which wasn't going to happen. So Bulgaria didn't lose that much territory. Of course, it's still forced to pay reparations and demilitarized, but it got off the most lightly out of any of the Central Powers. And then we have an interesting case with the Ottoman Empire, as it actually had two treaties. The first one, the Treaty of Sèvres, would basically force them to be colonized and carved up by the European powers. As we can see here, massive Italian protectorate, territories going to Greece to fulfill their Megali idea, which sought to unite all Greek peoples, an international zone, and British territory, French territory, Armenia, which Woodrow Wilson was pushing for some reason. But Then we have the Turkish War of Independence, where Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, yes, the same one from Gallipoli, he led the Turks in a fight against the Europeans and Greeks, and was able to bring them back to the negotiating table in order to get Turkey a somewhat more favourable deal, resulting in Turkey getting roughly its modern borders, minus Hatay down there, which was eventually turned back over to them. So, yeah, the Turks were the only ones that actually truly fought the treaty and actually got to renegotiate the results of the treaty. So, what conclusions can be drawn? So, overall, the Paris Peace Conferences weren't terribly effective. The idea was that they'd secure peace, that they'd prevent any future European wars. And this just wasn't the case. It just didn't work out like that. And there were, of course, a number of reasons. And well, the main reason is, well, Germany is not only the war guilt, not only the reparations, but is just everything. Like, they had taken enough away from the Germans to make them want revenge, but they hadn't taken away enough to ensure that Germany couldn't enact that revenge. And ultimately, all the treaties truly managed to do was spark immense resentment from the peoples of the former Central Powers nations, which would eventually lead them to elect people such as Adolf Hitler, and would then lead directly into the Second World War. And whilst the rise of the Nazis and the Second World War perhaps can't be entirely blamed on the Paris Peace Conferences, it did still play a very significant role in the outbreak of that conflict. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you have any further questions at all, please leave them in the comments below, and I will be sure to answer as many of them as I can. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.